Welcome to my garage. I'm Larry and I'm here with my friend Dick, who has coerced me into videotaping me talking about my cars, telling you tall tales. Exactly why he's doing this, I'm not exactly sure what his motivation is. I think it has certainly to do with the fact that my cars are more interesting than I am, and also possibly because he wants to preserve the information I have on the cars, since they're going to be around a lot longer than I will be. At any rate, I've always considered myself a car guy, and I've had a number of cars over the years, like most car guys. But to be honest with you, I always lean towards sports cars. That was my interest, and this is why I wound up with a couple of vintage Jaguar sports cars, which I currently have, and working for Chevrolet all those years, a career with Chevrolet. I also was pretty fond of Corvettes as well. But today we're talking about a street rod, a hot rod, if you will. And so how did that come about? Because it doesn't really fit the category of what you might think my interest would be. And it probably started in 1995 when Chevrolet decided to sponsor Hot August Nights, which is a gathering of hot rods, custom cars, and muscle cars in the Reno Sparks area of Las Vegas. It's a pretty large gathering. They've been doing it for 37 years. Started around 1987, and when I was there was about 6,000 cars. That's a lot of hot rods. At any rate, it was a great event. We had a factory display, which I was involved with, and one of the benefits of that was I had the opportunity to look at a lot of hot rods. And I was drawn to certain cars in particular that attracted me, namely 33 and 34 Fords. I found their styling appealing, and so I sought those out, and I found that I really liked those in particular. They're basically the same car, 33, 34 Fords. The grills are slightly different on them, and the 33 Ford has a single latch for the hood, whereas the 34 has a double latch, but essentially they're the same cars. So I decided that if I ever have a chance to have a hot rod, I'd lean towards one of those. But again, considering that I've had a career with Chevrolet Motor Division, it would be nice to have a Chevrolet. And I noticed there were some Chevrolets at that show as well. And they look very similar, so I thought those would be a possibility. But it also made me wonder, how come so few Chevrolets of that era versus Fords? And my opinion is that, first of all, and starting in the 30s, Ford had a 8-cylinder motor. They had the flathead V8, and Chevrolet didn't come out with their 6-cylinder, their V8, until 1955. So that might be one reason why anybody that was looking at converting a 30s cars to a hot rod, you had an advanced start with a car that already had an 8-cylinder engine. In addition to that, the body panels on the cars, on the Fords, had steel framing that kept the body panels in place. The Chevys used wood, so wood framing, and obviously wood is not as durable, doesn't last as long, so that becomes kind of an issue if you're going to restore a car over time, and you find yourself having to redo and rebuild the wood framing that's in it. Now I understand that you can actually purchase steel framing to replace the wood in those cars, but nevertheless, I went back to Oregon, went back home, and thought about getting a hot rod and looking at possibly a Chevy. But the first thing I'd have to do is probably let one of my cars go, because I didn't have the space for another car. And the car I decided to sell, which in hindsight was a huge mistake, was a replica of a 1953 Jaguar C-Type. I have a picture of one here. This is the car I decided to sell. It was made in England by Proteus. It's pretty much an exact replica of a 1953 C-Type, the same as ran at Le Mans, but since it was not the real thing, I thought I could do without it. In hindsight, it was a huge mistake. I wish I'd have kept that car, but I let it go. And some fella up in the Seattle area bought it. A fellow who had a fairly large exotic car collection. And I found out a little bit later, in fact, fairly soon after I sold it, that he was an accountant for a Catholic charity, and he was cooking the books, skimming funds, and that's how he got his exotic car collection, including my car. But he was found out and wound up going to prison, and the sheriff's department up there auctioned off the cars, including my C-Type. So I had the opportunity to go up and bid on it. I wish I had, because I found out that it actually sold for less than what I had gotten for it initially. So another big mistake. I should have gone and bought it back for less than what I had been paid for it. Didn't do that. But now I had an opening for another car, and I did find a 1935 Chevrolet on the East Coast. Now, I mentioned the Chevrolets had a Master and the Standard. This was a Standard Chevrolet. In 1935, Chevrolet came out with an all-new car. Had a new body that didn't have the separate fenders. It was an enveloping body that covered the car, and quite a bit different than the previous cars. However, they decided to continue production with the 1934 car. They just called that the 35 Standard, and their all-new car was the 35 Master. So the car I got was a Standard, which was the same car that they had in 34. So I purchased this 35 from the East Coast, and it was a car that really appealed to me because it had a pretty good history as a hot rod. In fact, it was on the cover of All Chevy magazine, not on the cover, but featured in that magazine, and still have a picture of it here. It was featured in really a super car. This is what it looked like. It was in a lot of car shows, etc. And I was glad to buy it, and got a lot of attention with this car. I belonged to a hot rod club, and I was the hit everywhere I went with this car. It was a terrific car. So, but eventually we decided to move to Arizona, and maybe another big mistake. I sold that car because I wasn't sure I'd have a place to store it when I got to Arizona. So it was gone. But I missed it. And when I arrived in Arizona, I decided, I need to look for another one, because now I had a shop where I could actually house that car, and let me see if I can find a replacement. And of all places, back in Oregon, I found one for sale, a car that 34 Standard Chevrolet that had been converted to a hot rod in the early 80s, so it was a long time hot rod. And the second owner had it for sale, so I went up to take a look at it, and there was a lot of things I liked about that car that made me decide to go ahead and buy it. And some of the things that appealed to me, I'll show you now. It had the original steel body. It had the original headlights and original tail lights, and the changes that had been made to it were great changes. The motor was a ZZ3 crate motor, 350 cubic inch, 350 horsepower. It had a Walker radiator with a cooling fan, and the chassis was a custom box TIG welded chassis. That was great. Rear end was a 9-inch Ford. It had Dutchman forged axles. The rear end had a Mercury Cougar 325 positive traction. So it was a well-built car. Some really neat features on it, which I like. Pop open the hood here. Now I made some changes to this car, and the engine stayed the same, but the styling of the car as a hot rod was quite a bit different than what I wanted. I wanted a car that reflected something in the late 50s or early 60s, the way I recall them. And this had a lot of billet and chrome. You open up the hood and just shine back at you which way. But so I converted with different valve covers, a different air cleaner that was more old school style. In fact, if you look, you'll see even the radiator cap matches those items. So again, try to give it more of a vintage look to it. The other thing on this car was it was two-tone. Now the body was this royal blue, but the fenders were black. So I wanted to change that and make the whole car blue. And the other things I mentioned about the all the bright work in there, well, the wheels were the same thing. The wheels were either chrome or had a lot of bright work in there, and they were basically star modern wheels, which didn't really appeal to me because they didn't have that classic look to them. So I wanted to change that, and I got the different wheels. But the biggest change was towards the back, because really what I wanted to capture, I wanted to give the car a rake, what they call a rubber rake, because the wheels on this thing were exactly the same front and back. So I had to change that. I wanted bigger wheels on the back so that it had this lean towards the front look to it. And but the problem was that it had the original style fenders, even though they were fiberglass, and I needed bigger fenders to match the bigger wheels with the white walls and all. So these happened to be 2 inches wider. What I did is I sent off for a outfit again in Oregon that made these kind of fenders, and when I received them, they were horrible. They were made just really not finished very well. I sent them back, and I remember there was a place in Oregon that specialized in vintage Chevrolet and hot rods that built fiberglass parts for them and bodies, etc. But it was called Old Chicago, and unfortunately it had gone out of business. But I was able to locate who the owner was. I contacted the owner and I said, "Do you still have any of those fenders that you made for the old Chevrolets?" And he said, "No, I don't, but I have the molds and I can build you a set." He did, shipped them to me, and that's what we've got here. They're from Old Chicago. They were made, I guess you could say, custom made for me in a way. But so that's what's on the car. I also had to change the running board because I needed the running board to mate with the larger fender in the back. So that's what we did. The running board that was on the car had these rubber mats, which I wanted to keep, again, because I wanted that vintage look to it. But I was told you're not going to be able to take those off and reuse them, so you'll have to find a new rubber. And when I looked for companies that were building the rubber for these 30s Chevrolet, most of them weren't making this particular year, or if they weren't going to be making it for another couple of years while they were going model by model, remaking the rubber. So I didn't want to wait. Got out my razor blade, started chipping, and I was able to remove the rubber off the old running board, glued it on here, worked fine. They told me you couldn't do it, but it takes time, a little perseverance. It can be done, which is what I did. So those are some of the changes here. Other changes, this had peep mirrors that I didn't like. They just kind of hang on this typical hot rod. You just hang on the window there. But I installed the rearview mirrors on the door hinge. So they're part of the door hinge. They work extremely well, not a problem. The interior required a lot of changes. It had Corvette high back bucket seats. And not only were they Corvette high back, they were also cloth covered high back bucket seats. Why they were covered in cloth, I don't know. But that's what was in the car. And so I changed that. These are Glide Engineering leather bench seats, which I thought was much more old school style than the high back bucket seats. Also, the transmission, which was a GM 400, Turbo 400 tranny. The gear shift for that was on the column. Changed that to a low car shift on the floor. It also had the original dash panel, Chevrolet dash panel, which is a little tiny thing in the middle there. Took that out. This is a Pro Shop manual or gauge panel with classic gauges. So made that replacement. Another change I made to this car was regarding the power windows. And it was nice that it had power windows, but typical of a lot of these hot rods, there's a switch that operates the window up and down. And I didn't think it looked very vintage. I wanted something that gave it more of a vintage look to it. So here's where the switch was, but I instead put a window crank. And all you have to do is tap on it. Down goes the window, or come underneath, push up, and the window goes up. The only thing about having a crank there is that if you've got somebody riding in the car with you, you have to remember to caution them not to crank the crank, because you're going to break it clean off if you do that. So it is just a power window, it's the switch, and I think it looks kind of neat. I was maybe a little remiss when I was talking about some of the other changes. One of the bigger changes was that this car came with Mustang 2 front suspension. Again, typical of a lot of hot rods. Most of them have a Mustang 2 front end. But what was different about this is that most of those suspensions are Mustang 2 type. This was not a Mustang 2 type. This was an actual Mustang 2 suspension out of a scrapyard Mustang 2. So that had to go. And I replaced it with a Heights style Mustang 2, which is a lot better than the original suspension that was on there. The other thing I did is I added GM disc brakes for better stopping power. And one other thing while I was thinking about it, on the cautious side, I added a puke tank next to the radiator. But really wasn't necessary because the car's never overheated or even come close to it. So it's been an extremely reliable car. It's done really a fabulous job of driving around with no issues whatsoever. I'm going to digress a bit because, yes, I did have one issue. Not too long after I bought this car in August 2009, my wife and I were coming back from a hot rod show. It was late at night, and we were on a back road, and my wife Kathy, I guess, was curious as to how fast the car would go, etc. And so she said, "Floor it." So I did. I stepped on the accelerator, and it immediately took off and immediately died down and came to a rolling stop with the engine running, but no acceleration and no throttle. What had happened is the cable going to the pedal had broken off. So here I was off to the side of the road. The engine was running fine, but no gas pedal. Went in my toolkit, found a pair of pliers, and if you yanked on the cable, that of course would accelerate the RPMs and accelerate the car, etc. So I wanted to get home, and it seemed that the most expeditious way to do it at that time was to just grab the cable, but of course it's right there at the gas pedal, and in order to do that, while I would still steer and drive the car and hit the brakes, etc., my wife, fortunate for her, was the one that she was going to get stuck with having to yank on that cable. So she got upside down, her legs up in the air, pliers on the cable, and I was giving her direction as to when to pull on it so that we had throttle and could accelerate, and telling her when to lessen on the cable so that we could come to a stop. It did get us home. However, the whole time I was really a little bit panicked that somebody would see us, or maybe somebody I know, and there I am driving down the road with these two pair of legs sticking up in the air next to me. That was my wife. So, at any rate, again, I digress a bit, but I'll tell you a bit more. Other little touches I made were, for example, the rear mirror up here was a Chevrolet rear mirror, which was rectangular in style. But now that I had this gauge panel that was oval, I needed a mirror that matched the panel. I did that. So those are little changes we made. It had a radio up here. I built this box for the radio with a Von Dutch flying eyeball. So the radio's buried back there. And also put a storage unit in the back. Didn't have that, so now it didn't have a glove box, but now you've got a storage area in the back. The other thing I didn't care for is behind the passenger side is where the battery was. So I relocated that, put it in the trunk. And the battery's back there now. I mentioned the original tail lights. It's got blue dots, which was a common thing that the hot rodders did on the cars in the 50s. Actually started in the 1930s. They were never a factory option. It was an extra that you put on the tail lights. Supposedly, it made the tail lights brighter. At least it gave it more of a magenta look than the bright red. And in the days in the 30s, when a lot of cars only had one tail light, a brighter tail light was a plus. These, no doubt, are they've been illegal in most states, and I think probably illegal today. But what the heck? This is a hot rod, and essentially everything about it is illegal. But here you have it. So I replaced the exhaust. It was coming out in a different location. I rerouted the exhaust. Gas filler is behind the license plate, which is kind of trick. All in all, a very nice car. Now, if you liked what I mentioned about the car and my stories about cars, I took the time to even write a book about it. Called Lobsters in the Snow. And it's a memoir. It's about me when I was raised in France during World War II. Regret to say it's given away my age, but nonetheless I was adopted by American GI, wound up immigrating to the States, to New York, when I was 7 years old. And my adopted grandparents there owned an Italian restaurant that was frequented by a lot of mafia types. So I got that observation when I was young. And eventually we moved to California, Southern California, San Diego, where I got involved with the car culture and eventually went to work with Chevrolet. And all this is in this book. And there's a lot of things about not only my background, but some shady aspects of Chevrolet that you might find of interest. So yep. I would certainly encourage you to look this up, Google it, Lobsters in the Snow. The title comes from the restaurant in New York, and it's got some 50-odd short stories in it, and it's heavily illustrated, over 200 photos. In case you're not good at reading, you can look at the pictures. Anyway, thanks for listening to me, and appreciate your time.